Now we turn to some facts and context about one of America's fault lines after this weekend's shooting. How we all view immigration. Our views come from experience, of course, from our feelings, from words, which is why battles over how to handle immigration often turn on the words we use. Undocumented versus illegal. Asylum versus anchor baby. Some words can be offensive because they are dehumanizing or worse. Now, Donald Trump's adopted the inflammatory language of invasion, and the El Paso shooter echoed that very language from Trump, as the New York Times reports, which has some Trump allies pushing back.
If you use the term as an invasion, that's not anti-Hispanic, it's a fact. If the Russians were coming through Alaska, through Canada, the president would be using the same language.
The primary definition of invasion is a foreign military invading. That's why it sounds ominous. So the Russian or Mexican military crossing the border would be a traditional invasion. Now, the word also refers to a large number of people entering a place. You can find dictionary examples of an invasion of fans at a stadium. In fact, people are looking up these very words right now. Invasions in the top 20 most searched words today at Merriam-Webster's website. Racism and fascism are in the top 5 for the week. So a lot of people are thinking about what these words mean. But there is more to the whole answer than just stopping at the dictionary definition. The El Paso shooter explicitly cited a white nationalist dogma, the replacement theory, that argues immigrant invaders are replacing basically white people in the West. Now, that doesn't mean everyone who ever picks the word invasion in a sentence intentionally means it that way. But this week, as Trump and his defenders publicly double down on invasion in this news cycle, it does mean they're on notice. The killer meant those words that way. And he is echoing a line of other mass shooters who cited the same replacement theory. So word 1, invasion. Word 2, replace. If replace rings a vague, sinister bell, well, that may be because of Charlottesville, where, of course, Trump proclaimed good people on both sides, because it was there in Charlottesville that white nationalists openly marched against racial minorities and against Jews and chanted about not being replaced.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!
That's America. Replace is also a word with a normal dictionary definition. Most people use the word replace in normal, typical ways. But even in lawful and nonviolent political discourse, that word's increasingly invoked in the specific political context that views immigration as a zero-sum threat.
Democrats know if they keep up the flood of illegals into the country, they can eventually turn it into a flood of voters for them. Their political success does not depend on good policies, but on demographic replacement.
Democrats who want to replace you, the American voters, with newly amnestied citizens and an ever-increasing number of chain migrants.
We've seen this in Europe. We're seeing it here, and they are attempting to replace us.
Attempting to replace us. Now, there are plenty of legitimate, peaceful arguments for limiting immigration. As we've noted on this program before, most countries with net positive migration have rules limiting it. But how you do it matters. How you talk about it matters. And how you talk about it, especially if you have authority, a megaphone, or power, can shape whether our nation sees this as another policy to be discussed and peacefully decided, or as something more akin to a war footing.
It's called an invasion, and thank God we have a president that will stand up to an invasion like this.
I don't care what the fake media says, that's an invasion of our country.
There's an invasion by foreigners into their country.
We have right now an invasion. If you look at what's going on with the caravans, it's an invasion.
They're just streaming across. This is a flat-out invasion.
Stop this onslaught, this invasion into our country.
This invasion. We need more than simplistic, politicized, and even hateful rhetoric right now. And we probably need more than just good faith criticism of that rhetoric. As we we go a little deeper on the language and the practice of this extremism, I'm joined by historian and Brown University Professor Monica Martinez, the author of The Injustice Never Leaves You, Anti-Mexican Violence in Texas, and Brian Levin, director of the Center of the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino. Thanks to both of you for being here. Brian, how do you chart the mainlining and spreading of these ideologies and these words? And where is the distinction or the good faith space for people who may echo a word or pick up a word and not even realize some of its hateful roots?
I think you're right. And by the way, there is an invasion of the United States going on by foreigners, but it's Russians. And some of the things that they're doing is manipulating social media to have anti-immigrant sentiment. We have all this in our latest report, which is on my pinned tweet at Prof. Levin. But let me answer your question. In the lexicon of the white supremacist movement, we actually had a computer analyst, Andrew Thompson, look at this kind of verbiage being used on places like 4chan, and we found that hate crimes and hate speech often, but not always, peaked around the same times, and often around political rhetoric. Let me just give you a couple of quick examples. November 2016, worst month for hate crime going back 14 years. James Nolan from West Virginia University and John Reitzel did a study with that. But also, listen to this. Bush speaks 6 days after 9/11. Hate crimes drop when he speaks of tolerance. Hate crimes dropped by 2/3 the next day against Muslims and Arabs and 2/3 the next year.
I'll let you continue, but I think you're citing his speech at a mosque.
Yes, at the Islamic Center of D.C.
This was a president who widely criticized for many things, but this was a president who saw 9/11 happen and went to a mosque to urge tolerance, such a contrast to today. So you're saying that while causality on any individual incident is obviously always very difficult in your field, you do see correlation there in what the political leaders are doing.
Oh, absolutely. Listen to this, too. Charlottesville. Worst month, I'm sorry, tied for the second worst month this decade. So give an example of that. When Obama was about to become president in October 2008, another spike month. So we can actually do day-by-day ticks using disaggregated FBI data, and we found that. And you can read that in the report. But what I'd like to do is actually respond a little bit outside the data world really briefly. And that is, Robin Williams from your old stomping ground at Cornell University, where my son wants to go, by the way, a professor emeritus said there's a printed circuit of stereotypes, and this printed circuit of stereotypes labels certain people as legitimate targets for aggression. So we need to tone it down. And even if somebody thinks that they're using a word that's a bit benign, for instance, in the hate world, in that toxic hate world, it has a particular meaning. And let me just say one other thing. Shortly before these attacks, President Trump was retweeting a British national who was convicted of hate offenses over in the UK. Right, and who was suspended, I believe, one of those accounts for terms of service violations for that very thing.
Monica, I want to get your expertise based on the work you've done. This is a serious segment, so I'm loath to joke around too much, but Brian is clearly caffeinated. I think that's clear. And Brian, I would love to get a hold of your source of caffeine, because you're coming in firing on all cylinders on an important topic, which we appreciate. So, Monica, bringing you in, your work sheds what light do you think on this discussion and on the point that I raised in the lead and that Brian raised, which is the way these words do have consequences?
Well, I'll say we need all the energy that we can get right now to demand social change. So I appreciate the energy. But the history of racial violence that I study on the Texas-Mexico border in the early 20th century has striking parallels to what we see today, especially when we see the loaded use of rhetoric that might seem benign, but that actually has deep roots in histories of racial violence and deep roots of eugenicist thinking that shaped immigration policies.
Explain
like the Immigration Act.
What you're referring to.
So in the early 20th century, especially between 1910 and 1920, hundreds of Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals were murdered by Texas Rangers, by local law enforcement, and by vigilantes. And this was a period of violence that was called for and inspired by the rhetoric of politicians and local residents who profiled Mexicans as bandits, as rapists and thieves, and as a threat to Americans. And so there was rhetoric of bandits crossing the Mexican border into the United States to terrorize Americans. And that violence was largely justified by the press and by politicians. And law enforcement enjoyed a culture of impunity, and that emboldened vigilantes to then go on and also commit crimes. And so this period of violence shaped our current institutions of border policing, but it also thankfully shaped a long tradition of Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals fighting for their civil rights and fighting against this hateful rhetoric, to trying to curb the tide to actually demand their own civil rights and to demand their place of belonging in the United States, which this rhetoric of invasion completely ignores the deep roots of Mexican Americans, many of which who've been in places like Texas since before Texas was a part of the United States.
And you mentioned how people are affected by it. Let's take a listen to some reporting we have of hearing directly from some young people impacted in El Paso. Take a listen.
To see that our city has been attacked by an outsider was just so hurtful and full of hate.
I'm having to realize that racism is so alive and strong that people are willing to kill us for it.
We're supposed to be one of the best countries in the world, and this is still happening.
To Monica and then Brian, does the scholarship tell us anything about inoculation, about how to help people, particularly young people who are coming up in these environments?
Well, unfortunately, history tells us that young people are victims of this violence. And so when we look at the historical record, young boys, teenagers were impacted, were shot and killed. And so when we think about the impact, we have to think about the way that it's going to shape generations to come. People who witness or experience this kind of violence, those sentiments of injustice stay with them for multiple generations, and it shapes the way that they think about their place in the world, their relationship to their government, and especially their relationship to law enforcement. But it's also deeply unsettling because places like El Paso are such vibrant communities that stand in the face of what white supremacists dream of a world being. This is a community of people who have a bicultural, a binational, a bilingual heritage and pride, and to have this community be attacked with such horrific violence is deeply, deeply disheartening. But it was also unsettling because people in El Paso, people in places like McAllen and Brownsville, they have also been in the front lines, literally picking up the pieces of broken humanity as a result of the state-sanctioned racial violence that takes the form and manifests in violent border policing and immigration policies like family separation and zero-tolerance policies. And so to have a community like El Paso that has carried the burden of trying to restore humanity and try to call for a more humane life on the border, to have this community terrorized and targeted should alert all Americans that we have a responsibility to demand change, to demand a more humanitarian immigration policy, and to demand policies that basic forms of gun reform to protect people so that everybody has basic rights of safety in our home communities.
I got to fit in a break now, but I want to really thank both of you for your expertise, Monica and Brian. And Brian, since I didn't get to come back to you, your son gets into Cornell. It's settled.
Thank you.
Thanks to both of you. High spirits on tough topics, and your work, I think, is invaluable. So we do appreciate it. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.